All right. So this time, on this occasion, we're going to discuss a very interesting letter, almost completely unknown, that we do in fact have. And this letter contains pieces, portions, and to some extent, a description of a very early Torah said by the Alter Rebbe in the Tuf Kuf Nuns, the 1790s. So that's before the Alter Rebbe was arrested. So that's fairly early, before most of the Torahs that the Alter Rebbe said. This is an early Torah the Alter Rebbe said in the Tuf Kuf Nuns for Parshas Miketz. And we have a letter containing portions of it and describing it. And as I'll explain shortly, I believe it's fairly interesting. I'll just take the occasion to quickly apologize for the break last week. We haven't recorded something in over a week. I hope you weren't too deeply disappointed. But Baruch Hashem, the latter half of last week, we actually had a simcha in our family, a happy occasion. So Baruch Hashem for that. And although there were some topics that were in the stages of preparation at the time, but due to events, for now they've been postponed. Maybe we'll get back to them sometime. So back on our topic for today, I'm going to launch now into a bit of a long introduction, intentionally, sort of some historical background, some general background. So just a heads up, it's going to take a bit of a while till we get to the actual letter, to the actual Chassidus. But I just wanted to discuss, maybe I've alluded to this observation before, that I find it quite interesting to the degree to which we're really lacking any information on what Hasidic life, Chabad Hasidic life was like in the earlier generations, pretty much up until the founding of Temchat Tmimim. Essentially, we have close to no information, no basic information firsthand of anything going on at the time. At most, we have some igros, some letters, and those two are a rather small number. So we have some igros, some letters from the Rebbe about some general matters, and maybe just a couple of individual private matters that happen to be preserved. We also have some details, some descriptions of the earlier years that reached us in the later generations, but b'pi hashmoa, so there's a chain of transmission. People were sharing stories, people were sharing memories. So there is some information that reached us that way, but that requires investigating what's accurate, to what extent it's accurate, and what can we squeeze, what can we extract out of the information that's more accurate, and what can we figure out by comparing sources to each other, and that whole process. We also there are some topics that are sort of hiding between the lines, in particular Titus of the earlier generations, or perhaps sometimes, as I've mentioned in the title, in the Ksav Yad, the title might say the time, the place. There might be some information, some background, some tiny nuggets of information there. So you have information that might be hiding in the Titus or in the Igris that you could also extract. You can squeeze it out if you're actively trying to. And in that context, I think we've already succeeded somewhat at doing stuff like that. We've demonstrated how there are details, there's information that's sort of hiding and can I don't know if it's in plain view or not, but it's there. And if you find it, you identify it, you can pinpoint and extract it and extrapolate from it. But I can provide endless examples of the fact that we really don't have any basic sense on any detail of what things were like, how the Alter Rebbe, Mitler, Tzemach Tzedek, how their Chassidim, how things actually operated. What did a weekday look like? What did a Shabbos look like? What did Yom Tov look like? Etc., etc. There are endless examples of what we don't know. And I think it's demonstrable. We can prove from the Rebbe Rashab's writings that even the Rebbe Rashab himself, Lamashal, it seems, did not really even have that much more information than we do today. So already by his time, that information had not been transmitted. So in other words, we can, for any given time and place, we can approach, we can attempt to define what was the culture of writing for that time and place. What were they writing? What were they transcribing? What were they preserving? Within that, there's also the subcategory of, even if they were writing, what was the culture of preservation? So perhaps people did write something or another, but perhaps that wasn't seen as important and it wasn't preserved. So the two things go somewhat together. Now we see that we have volumes and volumes and volumes of Torahs from the Alter Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek. So obviously there was a culture of writing Torahs, and there was a mechanism for preserving that. So by contrast, we can see what they weren't writing, what they weren't preserving. Clearly, they didn't. Apparently, wasn't seen as important to describe. For example, what did we know what the Alter Rebbe said on Hanukkah, but we know what the Alter Rebbe said about Hanukkah. But what did Hanukkah itself look like by the Alter Rebbe? No clue, no idea. It seems like it wasn't written, or if it happened to have been written, it was not seen as worthy of preservation, of copying, of transmitting. What we have proves the non-existence of what we don't have. And perhaps it's possible to using with this in mind, it's perhaps possible to be magder, to define that this is actually something the Frierdiker Rebbe was conscious of and was aware of, and that the Frierdiker Rebbe was consciously seeking to fill in these gaps, this kind of gap, and was writing and was seeking to depict aspects of life in the early generations in such a manner, in a manner that had been lacking, had been missing. And perhaps on another occasion we'll discuss the Frierdiker Rebbe's historiography and manner or method of writing, but that's another topic. But at the end of the day, I still believe that the gap is a gap, the hole is a hole. We don't really have visibility, we don't have insight into what was going on. So it would seem, therefore, that practically speaking, we do not seem to have a description that was written b'shas Maisa or even la'achar Maisa from someone Lamashal who was at the Alter Rebbe on this and this date and writing to his friend or recording for himself what happened on this and this occasion. Perhaps the exception, the Yitzim and Aklal, perhaps is the Sefer Sipurim Neroim for Bianco Kaidaner, who was doing a form of this kind of writing at a very early stage when it seems others weren't. So it seems like La'achar Maisa, he is describing, depicting certain incidents that happened with the Alter Rebbe, with the Mittler Rebbe, but still that is extremely, extremely limited. The stories that he's sharing are dafka meant to mostly be exciting, unusual stories, which is its own category, storytelling. And there's very little still about day to day, week to week, year to year of what's going on with the Alter Rebbe. And even the little that he does is more like the Yitzim and a klal that proves the klal, the exception that proves the rule. So the kind of writing where you're describing what's going on in the Hoif, but what's happening with the Rebbe, is a style of writing that began a bit in the period of the Frierdiker Rebbe. Right, we have Yemanim from the Rebbe's Chasana, from Altois, for example. So you have that style of writing begins appearing around that time. And of course, that became a very, very central, mainstream type style of writing with the Rebbe in this past generation, of course. There's endless material written in that style. There's stuff that was publicized pretty much right away and printed, or many copies were made and they got out there. There's also stuff that people wrote privately to themselves or to friends and are still being revealed and published all the time. So when you consider that, when you consider the style of writing we've become accustomed to in the last 75 years, 50 years, 100 years, whatever date you want to pick, but again, the contrast to the previous era becomes pretty clear, pretty stark. Now, the truth is, I should note that with the Alter Rebbe, we do find there are reshimis of yechidus. There are a number, I don't know what the exact number is, I would say somewhere between 5 and 20. Reshimis of yechidusin. People went into the Alter Rebbe and spoke to the Alter Rebbe about their avodah, and the Alter Rebbe spoke in a much more practical, personal manner with very practical eitzes, individualized eitzes, and these are recorded, these are transcribed. And even these are fairly unknown, but these have been written about before. Maybe we'll get to those on some occasion as well. So we have those, but still, that still doesn't really count as a personal description. There's no details describing anything relating to the setting the scene of what was going on at the time. To the extent that if you're going through the Svarim that print the Torah Alter Rebbe, you might, unless you're trained to look out for the shtiklach that are yechidus, you might even miss them if you don't know what you're looking for. So that's with regard to describing life in the Hoif, describing what was going on with the Rebbeim. But we also don't really have any documentation of correspondence between the Chassidim Bechlal. Certainly not of Teichendik correspondence. So that means we don't really have any documentation of how they actually spoke, interacted with each other, when they had a meaningful conversation by correspondence. Well, what might that have looked like? Again, in contrast to the way today we have endless thousands, perhaps more, recordings, articles. People are always happy and eager to share their take, to share their insights. And already starting from the generation of the Talmidim and Talmidim, we have those who began writing Zechrenis, began recording, transcribing things that they heard. So the culture of sharing the Chassidish conversations goes back roughly to around then. Now, it seems reasonable to assume that letter writing, the phenomenon of letter writing, already existed back then. People were always writing and corresponding to each other about whatever. So it seems safe to assume that there's at least some Teichendik writing and correspondence going on as well. And such correspondence would either have contained descriptions of what life was like in the Haif, or would have contained at least Teichendik thoughts, feelings. So one of the two types of writing that we've just described. But it would seem that in this case, the issue was that the culture of preservation was not extended, did not apply to this type of writing. So these were not preserved. They were seen as looking for the word, but stuff that's not meant to last the long haul. It's just disposable. In fact, from the period when the Chassidim started immigrating to the United States, we do find that we start finding letters that were preserved, perhaps more on the American end. Once people arrived here, there was a higher chance that correspondence would be preserved. And once you have the correspondence, so then that can give you a sample and give you an indication that the phenomenon of writing of correspondence, including in Teichendik and Yonim, did exist. You have the Sefer Toldos of Ram Chaim. I'm not going to get into the examples here, but we do have examples of this. And those were, I believe, even Chassidim who were still slightly older than the generation of Timchei Tamimim. So people were certainly writing, but again, it seems like it was considered more disposable writing, not something that was worth saving and preserving. On a personal, the reason why I'm speaking about this at such length is because on a personal level, I'm of the opinion that this gap in the documentation is kind of harmful. Not, it's a harsh word, but it's hurting us today. this lack of historical record is hurting us today, and it's making it a lot more difficult for us to really connect with, to relate to those generations, the people of those generations, and preventing us from uncovering, from discovering how they may have been similar to us, and in what ways they were more terhaibin than us. And in my opinion, generally, it's a big klal when it comes to learning, and in my opinion, it's true about any area of learning. Doesn't matter if it's lamdus, doesn't matter if it's Kabbalah, supposedly abstract or lofty topics. In my opinion, the key to learning involves finding a concrete personal connection to the material, and to feel and to see how the topic, how the subject exists in your world, relates to your world. And I find it of note, of interest, that you look at Mishnayos and Gemara, for example, and Mishnayos and Gemara dafka do have this living element. They do, to a great extent, convey the context, the details of what life was like, in a way, in the details that are relevant and pertinent to what's being discussed, of course. But it is presented, it is conveyed in that manner. You see it even going further. Tosfos, you see that if you look through Tosfos, you'll see there are plenty of bits and pieces of life that are contained there. A slice of life, as the phrase goes. And today, when you pick up a sefer, you can find entire svarim where there's not a single shred, not a single element of real life. It's all just abstruse, abstract writing and discussing. To me, that's I find that very strange and very suspect. But that's just my opinion, and we can maybe speak about it at greater length on another opportunity. So I think this is true for Chassidus Chabad as well. I always seek to find the parts, the bits that we can connect with, that we can relate to, that resonate in some sense. So whenever I am able to, whenever I detect, whenever I identify any sort of bit or piece like this, especially from the earliest days of Chabad, so that's something that makes me extra excited and eager to try to squeeze whatever we can out of it. So that's all by way of saying that on this occasion I would like to discuss a very obscure source that we in fact do have. There is something that we do have that has reached us, that has at least elements of a live report of correspondence, and it's dafka from a very, very early stage. But just the way it was printed, the way it appears in the Ksav Yad versus the way it was printed, has resulted in it being extremely, extremely obscure, and in fact not even published as one unit, but cut into pieces and spread across a sefer, to the extent that almost nobody has noticed it at all. So for 99.9% of us, I think this is essentially a new idea and the chiddush, even though technically the information has been there all along. And the following will be is connected, as relates to the connection that existed between the Mittler Rebbe in his youth, between the Mittler Rebbe and Reb Aaron of Starashela. Now, just a very quick way of introduction. I assume we all know something about Reb Aaron of Starashela. Sometimes those outside of Chabad purport to know about him more than maybe within Chabad, and there are those that are dafka fans of his Torah and are oisik in his Torah dafka. In fact, it's interesting. Lately, I was actually looking a bit at a fascinating document that was written during the Machlekes Taka after the Alter Rebbe passed away, when the Maril, the Alter Rebbe's brother, who was the Alter Rebbe's right-hand man in his writing in Nigla and Chassidus and in other aspects of the Hoif. And I think I already mentioned that after the Alter Rebbe passed away, he was also Azach. He also cast a shadow over the Hoif. He was his own parsha. So after the Alter Rebbe's passing, the Maril, the Alter Rebbe's brother, actually wrote a very sharp personal letter to Reb Aaron, against Reb Aaron and in favor of the Mittler Rebbe. And among other things, he seems to express particular criticism, specific criticism of the style of the Ba'anim Starashelas Torah. And maybe that's for another occasion to dig into that, but that's something I came across recently. You could also check, you could also compare the Kovetz of Ginzaya that was published 2 weeks ago that I mentioned recently, and it also covers the early years of the Mittler Rebbe's era and the different tensions that existed at the time. But when it comes to the Mittler Rebbe and Rav Anas Sarashela, really we can speak of 3 stages. There was the early stage, which Rav Aaron was considered a chashav and talmud of the Alter Rebbe, and that itself could probably dig deeper into that if we wanted to figure out chashav relative to whom, which age group, because surely there were different age groups among the Talmidim Chassidim of the Alter Rebbe. That's the first stage, the first phase. Then the next phase, there was some kind of richuk. The Reb Aaron was demoted, which Maril alludes to in that letter that I mentioned. So whatever happened there. And then there's the tkufa after the Alter Rebbe that is the most famous that people know about. And Reb Aaron, of course, said and wrote his own Torah that was published. And that's its own whole story and its own parsha. But specifically, when it comes to the first stage, when it comes to the first phase, in addition to his standing as a Talmud of the Alter Rebbe, we also have to address the fact that there was also a very special connection, dafka, between the Reb Aaron and the Mittler Rebbe in his younger years. Just for context, Reb Aaron was born in the year Tovkuf Chavav, and the Mittler Rebbe was born in the year Tovkuf Lamed Dalet. So Reb Aaron was 8 years older than the Mittler Rebbe. But the Aaron was still about 20 years younger than the Alter Rebbe, so just to place where he fits in. So it seems that at some stage, Reb Aaron served almost as like a senior chaver to the Mittler Rebbe. And in fact, we find from this period that there actually is some correspondence, dafka, between them that we do have, that has reached us. And it's in fact written in a very, very interesting, unique style. And it's a very interesting representation of the spirit of what, the spirit, the vibe of what the Chassidus looked like at that very, very early stage. It's a very powerful representation of that. Rabbi Shua Munshine in his Kerem Chabad, Volume 1, that he printed in Tafshemem Zion. So if you look there, page 97 onward, about 5 pages or so, he printed the letters of Reb Aaron Starashela to the Mittler Rebbe from copies. It was copied. It was one of the things the Chassidim would copy in their Kisvei Yad. I think Monshe mentions that it was copied a lot, and many of the copies were dafka riddled with errors. In particular, perhaps because a big portion of them of these letters are actually written in Yiddish, which itself is very interesting. Written in Yiddish, and it's written almost, you could say, in like a Vilda style. I'll quote just a few short examples of the style of writing there. So, for example, you have a lashon there, Unlaman Hashem, Gewaltbruder, Zamatren de Moyach Gor Wild, Al Yidei HaEsbeirenus V'das B'gdulas and Seif Baruchu, B'chtei Arois Zabrengen Nekudas Halev. So I'm not going to translate it line by line, but if you understand Yiddish, you know that's a pretty interesting tone, pretty interesting language. Another quote there, V'amechuven Mikol HaChasidus, Hu rak al goydel gases haruach kayadua. Ki tzorech li is tvira derucha, v'achar kach tkifa de nafshe v'dal, laman Hashem, arum tzukuken arum zich gor wild, afilu chitzeines, ki yesh primius, und warf weg dein meise yingel, also oif sein beginnes chaloim. That language there is a bit unclear, maybe we need more manuscripts to clarify what's going on there, but warf weg dein meise yingel, nit zemateren de moyach, rak laman Hashem, zemateren gor wild. So I think the pacing here is something about, it shouldn't be a cholam, nit zemateren de moyach. That would be the Maisa Yingel, Cholam, Nitzmatrin Demayach, something like that. Raklaman Hashem, Tzematrin Gor Vild. First of all, I'll just comment on the wording, on the language. The phrase Laman Hashem in these two quotes appears 3 times. It seems like Laman Hashem generally was a much more common phrase in Yiddish back in the day. It's roughly equivalent in English to saying for God's sake, or maybe a little more edel, for heaven's sake. I'm sure many other languages as well, there's something equivalent to that. And if you look in old Yiddish writing, you find the phrase actually many times. including, if I recall correctly, from another very interesting source of Yiddish writing, which is, if you look in old Shilas Teshuvos, going back to at least the 1600s, but definitely 16, 17, 1800s, you find the genre of Gvias Edus for Agunas. So if someone would disappear, and they were trying to track down where the man ended up, whether he was killed, so the Batei Din would bring witnesses, potential witnesses in, and they would transcribe their Edus word for word, and then those Edusim would be forwarded to the greater Poskim for their consideration. And a lot of Shuvas preserve very interesting Yiddish Edus written. Well, I mean, from in my opinion, my impression is that they're actually written literally in the manner in which they were said, so you actually get a sense of what spoken Yiddish was like at the time, which is very rare. Not many other ways to find what that might have seemed or sounded like, but that does seem to be preserved in these writings. So I think in those types of writings as well, you'll notice Laman Hashem get thrown around liberally. My impression is that among Yiddish speakers or those adjacent to Yiddish speakers, the phrase is a lot less popular, although it perhaps hasn't disappeared completely. And maybe that's related to a decrease in phrases invoking God, invoking heaven in general, which is its own interesting topic, maybe for another time. So back to these in terms of these letters of Rabbi Aaron. Another point I wanted to also make, another footnote, is that I'll also point out that in the context of my general interest in Yiddish of the early generations of Chabad. Now, the truth is, I'm interested in Yiddish from all generations and from all eras. But every generation, every era's Yiddish has its own characteristics and its own chavivos. So one of the forms of Yiddish I'm interested in is the Yiddish of the early generations of Chabad, which was different in a number of ways from the Yiddish of the later generations. And usually, it's just a phrase here, a word there, like we saw not that long ago with Mittel Rebbe's Torah on beauty. But here, you literally have a wealth of chaimer. You have entire sentences and paragraphs here from Rabbi Aaron to the Mittel Rebbe, and so it's interesting for that reason as well. And maybe that's also something to talk about on some other occasion. But at any rate, if you look in those letters, like I said, printed by Moshe and Kerem Chabad 1, you'll find there are many other very interesting lashonos there that give the sense that it's almost written like an early Hasidic pep talk, given in this style, where Rabbi Aaron is giving this sort of a pep talk to the Mittel Rebbe in Inyani Avoda in Chassidus. I can't go through all the quotes that are geschmack there, or else this will end up being on a different topic than planned. But I'll just point out there's one more lashon there, perhaps of interest, perhaps of note. He says, "Mein liebe Bruder, al tisram alai shani marchik oischa, leikein, ani deirish tevascha be'emes, ukefi sichli ani misnaig imcha bechvedus letevasecha, zu schlagen der groben Litvak shehushav v'sheker. Ani kasher avadati v'chulu." So again, I'm not translating these, but very interesting lashonos. Another footnote I'll point out before we move on to the topic at hand is that if you look in those writings of Rabbi Aaron, on two occasions there at least, there's a use of the term harav. So, for example, it says Tishamaya Shamaiti Masha Doresh Dorash Harav, or Bezel Asher Shamanu Meharav. And when I noticed that, this tied into something I'd noted to myself recently, which is that if you actually look at the writings of the first generation, there's evidence that today, when it comes to how we refer to the Alter Rebbe, so the Chabad, of course, says the Alter Rebbe. The Welt uses other terms. The Welt is not going to call the Alter Rebbe. He's not. They don't identify him as their Rebbe. Maybe they have their own Alter Rebbe from their dynasty. But you have Balatanya, but you also have a very common term for the Alter Rebbe is the Rav. And often the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, which in Chabad is called Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and the Welt is called Shulchan Aruch Harav. Certainly in the Chassidish Welt, Lutvische Welt, they like to use the term Graz, which is another discussion. But in the Chassidish Welt for sure, and I think it's the general Eastern European world up until however many decades ago, the top term for the Alter Rebbe was the Rav. So where does that term come from? So what I noted to myself recently was that if you look through the writings of the first generation, there's seemingly evidence that this term, the Rav, the origins of the Weltklung Alter Rebbe, the Rav, is in a term that was being used in the Alter Rebbe's own sviva, meaning that the Alter Rebbe, within his close circle, it seems, was referred to as the Rav. And the proof of that would be from a number of writings in Lashon HaKodesh, particularly from the Maharil. If you look through Sheidas Yud of the Maharil and elsewhere, you'll see numerous times where the term for the Alter Rebbe casually is Harav. Harav Shichya, Harav. You see it a lot. Once you start looking for it, you'll notice it. So that would suggest that the fact that they're using Harav so much in Hebrew is alluding to the fact that he was known in his own circle by some. He had this nickname, the Rav. Once we establish that, then we can start cladding what was the nature of the kinoi. Is it along the lines of Rabbi Soloveitchik, of course, a generation ago, also ended up being known to many as the Rav. So is there some commonality there or not? But and it's of course the topic of names and nicknames is its own interesting topic for another occasion. But so it would seem to me that the Alter Rebbe was known in his lifetime as the Rav, and perhaps I've pointed out, perhaps even from a very young age, because I believe in the Pinkas of the Chavre Kadisha, which is its own topic I was looking into recently. In the Pinkas of the Chavre Kadisha of the Yazna, from the Alter Rebbe's childhood, I believe there's already a Lashon Rav Tan Upalig, which also suggests to me perhaps that even at the age of 13, he was known as the Rav, so some kind of nickname, and so perhaps they were alluding to that when they said Rav Tan Upalig. They were riffing on an existing nickname. So it would seem that Alter Rebbe was known by this name, and then just at some later point, within Chabad, it didn't seem appropriate to continue using that. So he was known as the Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, but was then preserved by the rest of the Welt, and that makes sense to me, because otherwise, why would the Welt, Dafka, elsewhere begin calling the Alter Rebbe that? How would that happen? So it makes sense that it had started with an Alter Rebbe circle, it was dropped in Chabad, but it is preserved elsewhere. So in light of having made a note of that recently, it's interesting to note that Reb Aaron in his writings here as well says Doresh Harav Asher Shemanu Meharav. At any rate, this means that we actually do have an example, a sample of this genre of correspondence, of these interactions between Chassidim. Of course, this is not, even for their era, these are not exactly your average folks. These are people in a class of their own. But Adarabah, that makes it more special. You have this type of correspondence from people of such a caliber. So this does, in my view, this does give us a window, a glimpse of a Poel Mamish. How do they actually talk? How do they actually interact? How are they Isaac in Inyane Aveda? And from the entire style of writing, it certainly demonstrates that this was Taka standing at the center of their lives. It wasn't sometimes in our era today. You go to yeshiva and you spend hours learning the topic, but is that what you're writing about? Is that what you're texting your friend about? Is that what you're emailing your friend about? Obviously, no one's really writing physical letters anymore, but the equivalent today. So somewhat unlikely to find that type of writing today, but here you see that in their correspondence at the time, this is what they were actually writing to each other about. So that's, up until now, that's what is relatively known, although even that's almost completely unknown, but at least it's officially been out there, it was printed officially in Kerem Chabad, so at least, for example, for me, it was accessible, and I came across it many years ago, and as I always say, whatever you know for more than a couple of years is Yedua to you. So for me, it's Yedua already for many years, having come across it many years ago. I always knew you have these writings of Aaron, although I never really stopped to examine them, and in the light of the project, this current project that we're doing, it led me to re-examine them, and like I said, perhaps we'll examine them some more on some future occasion. But that's somewhat yedua, perhaps in quotes. But what's even less yedua is that that's not the only thing, and there is an additional thing that's also documented. We have it in the Kisvei Yad, it's in print, and this was also written in an interesting, unique signoin style. And the truth is that if you look in Kerem Chabad there, Munshain does allude to this stuff as well, in short, in his Akdama there, but that's where he left it. He mentioned the Akdama, but he didn't copy it into that chapter in the Kerem Chabad. So on this occasion, we will attempt, perhaps for the very first time, to actually give it its due attention. And one last comment before I jump in, I'll just mention again, I believe I've already mentioned it, that in my opinion, we could very much use a new sefer, picking up from where Migdal Oz, which Munshain also printed, left off, but Masuder in a different seder, in a different style, that's more in line, more appropriate for how we're able to write in this day and age. I believe we could very much benefit from a sefer that would contain all of these dafka, especially all of these shtiklach that don't have a home, that are interesting but don't have a particular. They're not a mimer, they're not an igeres, and they're scattered, and even if they're printed, some of them are not printed. And to explain, to give a proper presentation to each one, to explain what it is and why it's interesting and why it's unique. And certainly at the top of that list, if such a sefer were to come into existence, certainly at the top of the list would be this type of genre, this writing, this correspondence, which Chassidim back in the day also found interesting and copied into their notebooks. So Ad Kan, the big Hakdama, and now we're going to actually jump in pretty much straight into the letter itself, and I'll read it first and explain it a bit, and then afterwards I'll explain what we know about the letter, who wrote it to whom. So the following inyan appears in the Sefer Maamarei Admar Azaken Aktzarem, which is an interesting sefer in its own right. The following inyan appears there, or maybe perhaps more accurate to say, is scattered there, as we'll see. But this is what the one writing writes. I believe it's on page Chaf in the Maamarei. So I don't have the page number in front of me, but I might have it later as we move along here. But I believe it's around page Chaf. And this is what the writer writes. It says, "V'ata idiacha prote protius mikol ha'inyan davar kotten v'gadol miroish ma'at hachsidis haktoivim v'ktsara echtev lecha la'achayescha ala aretz nachriya." So now I'm going to report to you in great detail everything, small, big, the good shtiklach of chassidus. I'm going to write to you to revive you, to give you chayas where you are far away. Eloheim bekitzer muflag, and here it is, bekitzer. You'll also get a hataka. So this is in a way very much parallel to a letter that could have been written in Brooklyn in the Chafs or Lamids, where someone might write to a friend, look, you're going to get the official. They'll get the official Rishima. They're gonna maybe in the later they would say we're gonna fax you the official Rishima, so you'll see what the official record says. So you'll get the official Ataka from last Shabbos' Torah. But I'm also going to share with you what I found of interest, what I found notable. The Kitzur Muflag. Here's the good stuff. This is what the writer is writing. So it's pretty clear from this that whatever comes next is being written as a letter and a report of the Torahs that were said by someone who was present to his friend who was not. And in fact, this paragraph that I just read itself was not printed in the Pnim, in the Maamarei Aktzarem, but rather in the Hara, and I'll get to that a bit later. This is what the letter says. This is the Torah. V'loi zochar sad hamashkim shehu knei chachma sheisbor lekamon es Yosef. Because the Sar Hamashkim didn't remember Yosef, Lachin Parei Cholim. The end of Vayeshev is the reason, is the impetus for the beginning of Miketz. Because he didn't remember, that's why Parei entered a dreamlike state. What's Parei? Who's Parei? Pirush Parei hu Priya. Klipa Daka, Noiga. So that's Pashat Gerev. When we talk about Parei, it's when it comes to the Mila, you have Bila and you have Priya, you have the Klipa Gasa. And you have the Klipa Daka. The Klipa Gasa is the Gimel Klippus, and the Klipa Daka is Noiga. That's on a lower level. But Pirush Pari Kedusha, but on a higher level, Pari in Kedusha is Hiskalus Kol Hidden Stimin. As we know, it's being Pereya, it's revealing all the hidden supernal lights. Mitzayin to Zoyar, Kaniskar Parshas Vayigash, Vakol Nishma, the Galia Kol Butzinin. That's the source for this pretty famous idea. Anyone familiar with Chabad Chassidus is probably familiar with this idea that Pari B'Kedusha is a Skalus Kol Hidden Stimin. The Rebbe mentioned it a lot as well. So V'nizka B'Lekutei Torah, and Lekutei Torah back then referred to the Arizos Lekutei Torah, that Shehi Malchus D'Atzilus, Shehi B'Vchinas Katnus Roish, or B'Vchinas Katnus Roish LaShualim LaHalbish Bigdei Choil Hu Etz Oitzem HaYerida Shetislabish Beicholos Debriya Kaniska Parshas Pekudei, presumably Zohar again, V'Heim Zayim Paris Toivus Ubriyas. So this is referring to Malchus D'Atzilus. Malchus D'Atzilus can be godless, in a state of Galus when it's in Atzilus itself, when it's interacting with Atzilus, and it could be in a state of Katnos, or Reish LaShualim, it's the greatest, but the greatest of the lowlier group, when it's taking off its Big Day Shabbos to put on the Big Day Choil, and during the Choil we know Malchus is Yored to Bria, and Shabbos is Aliyah So'ilamas, so that's Big Day Shabbos, but during the week there's the Big Day Choil. So Malchus Atzilus is Katnos, Reish Shualim, Big Dechoil, this Yerida to the worlds of Bria. But in that state, it's still the Zion Paris Toivus Ubrias. So you have the 7 cows, that's Bria, but at least the Paris are good, they're healthy. What are the sickly cows? What are the bad cows? Paris Harois, Hey Mecholas di Yitzira. That's already Yitzira, Mapneshem, Murovim Toivera, because Yitzira is already described as Toivera, it's Adas Toivera. In the Bria, in Bria it's Rubei Toiv Miutera. So in Bria it's Zion Paris Toivus, and in Yitzira it's the Paris Harois. And what happens in the dream? Hema Boilim Zion Paris the Bria, the 7 bad cows swallow the 7 good cows. Because the way the world actually runs, the world as we know it, is Dafka through passing through the state of Yitzira. And it's like Bria is incorporated and almost like swallowed within Yitzira, as if Yitzira is running the show, the way Yitzira does things. So the bad cows swallow the good cows. Yitzira swallows Bria to the extent that you can't identify, you can't recognize the state of Bria. It's all a state of Yitzira. And that's all Pari's dream. So as we seem to indicate, Pari refers to Malchus D'Atzilus. So when Pari enters Bria and then Bria is swallowed by Yitzira, that entire state is a state of Pari Cholim. Pari is in a dreamlike state. In a dreamlike state, you don't have the Moichin, you're B'chinas Katnus. This is all describing it more in terms of how things are Lamaila, but it is also alluding to, as we're about to see, we're going to segue into Lamata down here about Veda, as the Alter Rebbe always does, where it's every statement has a duality, both describing the spiritual reality above and the reality in Aveda down here. So, of course, before going forward, the description here of the Zion Paris Harois obviously is supposed to have a certain negative connotation, even though that's the Lamaila, it's describing the usual Seder, it happens every week, but it's still being presented in a very negative tone, and therefore the equivalent in Aveda, the equivalent of Zion Paris Harois in Aveda, is going to be a negative state, an undesirable state. So here we're starting to segue a bit to the Aveda. What causes this? To Big Day Shabbos. L'slabish b'Big Day Choil, to remove the Big Day Shabbos, to dress in Big Day Choil, as we explained the significance of just above. It's not remembering Yosef. And what is Yosef? But it's Yosef who his spashtus kol b'chinas legarmei b'tachlis rak lasas nachas ruach liyotzrei. The lashon his spashtus kol b'chinas legarmei b'tachlis in this context seems to mean that his spashtus is melashon removal, not the way hispashtus has come to usually mean in the Chabad lexicon, which is a positive sense of spreading the usually hispashtus and that itself, the terminology of Chabad itself, is of course its own interesting topic. It would be interesting taka to track the development of certain terms, because Alter Rebbe seemingly coined a lot of terms that we take for granted. So, for example, hispashtos would be interesting to track the use of the term hispashtos. But in this context here, hispashtos kol bechinis legarmei b'tachlis seems to mean to remove, to throw away the legarmei, which in this context means, as we're segueing to avoida here, it's you're serving the Eibishter, but it's legarmei, you're serving Hashem, but for your own sake. You have to remove that. Yosef represents getting rid of the legarmei, and it's rak lases nachas ruach liyotzrei. Yosef is about just wanting to do what the Eibishter wants, whatever makes Hashem happy. B'chol ikar nekudas ha'avoda einay ela lahaisif riboy tainag lamayla. And here it becomes explicit. We're talking about avoda. The whole point of avoda is ultimately not about yourself, but to do whatever adds tainag, divine pleasure, lamayla. Whatever, to whatever extent you're adding tainug lamayla, that is the true tachlis. That's the real purpose, the real point of your avodah. So throw away the legarmei. Stop thinking about what you want, what you're seeking to get out of it, and the barometer, the metric is what is moisef lamayla. So Yosef Meloshin being moisef, komashi yatoisef. Tainug lamayla, that's Yosef. So how do you get to remove the Bigdei Shabbos? The Leslavish Bigdei Chayil, that's if V'loi Zachar is Yosef. If you don't remember Yosef, you don't remember that the point is not about yourself, but Yosef, Tainug lamayla. So then you have this. Then you end up in this state in Avodah of Paricholim. The 7 good cows are swallowed by the 7 bad cows. Laneda Kibola Kerbena, as we'll explain just a little bit more shortly. So Nimtza Muchrach Memela Shla'achar Kol Adveikus HaToivim Shalei B'Tfila Yiyu Kol Yehoyim Ha'elam. So what's going to happen is that all the good dveikus that you had from davening will turn into nothing. Although the language, the syntax here is a bit unclear, but my impression is that he's returning back to the beginning of the sentence here, that if Elei Zachar, and then he goes off to explain what Yosef is, so that's in the positive sense what Yosef is, but Nimtza Muchrach is if Elei Zachar is Yosef, so then, if Elei Zachar is Yosef, then you're going to lose all the dveikus from Tefillah is going to be Kalei Hoyu Me'olam. And it continues and he says, Mizeh Yuchal HaMaskol Limtzoi Shelo Yismalu Kol Yomav Me'avodasi B'Tefillah Ad Shenidme She'ein Tzarich L'Talmud Torah Rak Adrav V'chulu. So based on this, in light of this, Maskell, the intelligent person, can understand that you're not supposed to be filling your entire life with avodah and tefillah, which may have been, for those for whom that may have been their first instinct. It's just about spending your whole life avodah and tefillah, to the extent that you think that there's no point. Where does Talmud Torah, where does studying Torah even fit in? Rak adrabe chulu. So in light of all this, now we can understand why you can't just stick to tefillah. You also have to balance it out with Talmud Torah. So adrabe, but Yosef Eimetz rak lasis kalim b'dira b'tachtoinim legilei hamshachas alikos. Instead, you have to focus on making kalim adira b'tachtoinim for alikos down here, which is by engaging in Torah and mitzvahs down here, as opposed to just sticking to tefillah, which is an upward state. You also have to focus on a downward state, which is a taich of that phrase. You have to live dafka in this world. And back to taich, get into the pasuk. So v'heim shnasayim yomim. He says, "Miketz shnasayim yom." What's the shnasayim yom? Torah shebeksav, v'Torah sheba'alpeh, chakam u'mevin chulu. So you need to have the shnasayim yomim. And even though engaging in that will also call off your state of ava, this is a necessity. We know this, that the more kalim, you have so many kalim, then the iris subside. I assume I'm assuming it's that this cloud, this rule of ribi kalim mistalko iris, is something that's common in Yitzchayim. We have to, I guess, fact check whether that's true. But we're telling you to make kalim, and we're telling you we know the side effect. Making more kalim means less iris, but this is what you're supposed to do. So therefore, this is all what you're meant to be doing. But Yosef, Amar B'taining, if you don't remember Yosef, if you don't remember what the goal is, Amar B'taining L'mayla, Uba L'vchinas Mikates Yomim. So then it's Mikates Shnasayim Yomim. Instead of being engaging in Shnasayim Yomim, it's Mikates Shnasayim Yomim. It's the end of being Isaac in both Torah Shabbat and Torah Shabbat. And then Upari Choylem, and then you enter a dreamlike state, which we said is B'chinas Katnas. So then you have the Brias, you have the Rois, the Brias are swallowed by the Rois, and then you enter into the world of the 7 cows. Of Chinas Yosef, but Yosef himself, when it comes to Yosef, Nisker, Toiv, Leira, Kanal, Vidabo. If you stick to Yosef, then you don't enter this whole realm. You don't have Toiv, Leira. So in short, what it's saying is, it turns out that Yosef is about focusing on adding Tainug Lamaila, which means to have to give up on a perpetual state of avodah, but you also have to create kelim lamata through limud Torah, which is what is called Dira Petachtonim in the language of the Alter Rebbe. In the original context, seemingly it referred more to giving like a physical anchor to your Yiddishkeit, to your Judaism. It's to engage in Torah mitzvahs, and that's the Dira Petachtonim. And if you don't do that, so then you'll end up falling even further. You're complaining that that's focusing on Torah cools the fire of the Ava. But if you neglect it altogether, then what's going to end up happening is upari chaylim. Then you're going to fall even further, and it's like you said earlier, the dveikus is hayu klei hayu mi'olam. So that's the main Inyan in this at this point in this letter, and then it goes on and it says in interesting language here, oid vertel. And here's another vertel. I'm going to show you another vertel, another vert that he said, and this is a bit more technical. Knei chachma, in the context here, you have the Maamre Chazal of like being koine chachma, but then in the Alter Rebbe's Torah it turns into knei chachma. There's the kana of chachma, and the kana of chachma hu mechaber hamayach lahalev. That's what connects the mind to the heart. Hu mitzanan halev bam shachasi leichas me'amayach, and this is the pipe that cools the heart by drawing moisture from the brain. So the letter writer says, Usha'altiv, so he said this, Usha'altiv, and I asked him, Ma inyan hakana lapare, what's the connection between this concept of kana and the concept of pare? That's what I asked him, Beheshiv, and he answered me that pare is hipoch ha'oiref. Ha'oiref is the back of the neck. Pare is the opposite, Shumakar hadibur bechinas eskalus, and of course, we know that that's also called you have the kana, the veshet, it's the terminology for the pipes. So you have the kana, hadibur, parai, revelation, the opposite of ha'eref. So that was the question, that was the answer. And then he says, isa bebehema shu emes, and you see in an animal that this is true, ad kan dvarav. And the letter writer says, bikashti lohedia kavanose, and I'm asking to let me know what he meant by that. So the letter writer seems to be asking his colleague, the recipient, to explain. He's writing, this is what I asked, this is what he answered. Can you please explain to me what he meant? And I myself am not 100% sure what the Alter Rebbe meant. Maybe he's referring to the lack of speech in an animal, but I'm not 100% sure. I also saw that, actually looked up one of the Kisvei Yad, and I saw that the wording there looked a little different. Instead of shahu, it said vizehu. So we still need to get to the bottom of what exactly the back and forth there was about, and what's that lashon haleda isaba behema, but also somewhat interesting. And then the letter writer adds one more line: "V'zeyos v'shel chayes hu apseilas gam ken yayin toiv acha adam bekelev agashmiyim nasa yayin mishaker shetitorev daiter sheyishkach oil mazeh v'yitzak al Hashem." I'm not going to try to explain that, but in a moment I'll tell you where you can look this up and get a better understanding of what that is referring to as well. The wine and the yayin mishaker, and to lose your mind. What is that referring to? So what is this letter, right? So this is the teichen that appears here in Maammar Aktzrim. Like I said, I believe it's page chaf. So that's the shtickle there that you find. So I just read the entire shtickle, and as we said, it seems like it was written as a letter, but there are seemingly no other identifying details. So now let's take a look at the ha'aris in the Maammar Aktzrim. This is written. The sefer was put together by Rebbe 11. So Rebbe 11 Rebbe Levin writes, המשקים. This is printed in Bnei Yerushalayim. It was already printed in the Sefer of Shor Titus, printed by, I believe, by Bachovsky back in Europe. It's in the number of Kisvei Yad. And in two of these Kisvei Yad, it appears as part of a letter, which begins, the paragraph, the line that we began with. So that suggests that this is a letter. Now, in this Sefer Maamer Aksarim, they only really cared officially about the Titus. And so that line from the letter that indicates that it's a letter isn't the Torah, so they didn't print it in the Pnim. But in Haaretz, at least, they expressed a little bit more interest in the background, the context, the date. So because that paragraph at least contributes to that, so at least we got to find it printed down below. So at least we're lucky for that. And then comes a bit more detail. The letter writer at the beginning said that you're also going to get a hataka of the Torah from Shabbos Ha'avar, from the last Shabbos. The Torah of the last Shabbos, Rabbi Levin writes, is referring to the Maamer Vayihi Miketz in Torah page Lamed, column Gimel. That's the first Maamer in Torah for Parshas Miketz. And a number of Kisvei Yad state that it is from Parshas Miketz, Shabbos Chanukah, Tovkuf Nun Zayin, when the Alter Rebbe was in Shklov. This is a number of that Maamer, the Kisvei Yad that contain that Maamer. They give us this information. They say it's Shabbos Chanukah, Tovkuf Nun Zayin, Shklov. So Ibazoi, the Teichen of this letter is the same Teichen of that Torah. So this and it says it's Torah from Shabbos Ha'avar. So this letter must have been written the next week, and he's writing a number of things that were said in that Maamer, but in the form of a letter. And he's adding Oid Vertul, Usha'altiv, Veheshiv, Bikash Leidia Kavanasai. This is all the letter writer, the tone of the letter writer to the recipient. And Taka, when they printed the shtickle in Bnei Yerushalayim, they wrote Shayach l'Shabbos Chanukah Tovkuf Nun Zayin. And in another Ksav Yad, it says Bir al Teras Miketz, meaning you have the Torah as it was said. And this letter was like sort of well, I don't know if beer is mamish the best term for it, but that was the term that they used there. But it's additional, it's supplementary material, let's say, to the Maamer and Torah. So what we have here essentially is a very rare case where, in addition to getting the actual Torah as it was said, which reached us, we also have a letter from one of those present who's writing to and reporting to his chaver about it. And that's why I said this is extremely, extremely rare and unusual. And if I have the opportunity, it's certainly not going to happen on this occasion. And in fact, I see the time is ticking down to Nittelnacht, so I'm not even sure I'm going to get through everything I wanted to discuss on this occasion. But perhaps later this week, if we get around to it, I'd like to dig in a bit more to compare how the letter writes it compared to how the Torah says it. But this is not all. This is not the entire letter. And those Kisvei Yad, which presented as a letter, there are additional passages that come afterwards. A passage that begins Tzadek v'Noisha, a passage that begins Oid Bir Inyan v'Yachsef Yaris, a passage that begins Ki Adam Eitzel Sada, and a passage that begins Tnu Yayin Lemari Nefesh. These four passages were scattered across Maamer Aksarim, meaning because Tzadek v'Noisha went into the pasuk in Zechariah, so it was printed. The first part of the Sefer is Lefi Seder Psukim and Tanakh. So that passage was printed in the spot for Zechariah. And V'Yachsef Yaris was printed in the spot for Tehillim, and Ki Adam Eitzel Sada was printed in the spot for Dvarim, and Tnu Yayin was printed in the spot for Mishlei. These additional passages also seem to have been written in the style of a letter, because you see the lashon there, Oid Bir Inyan, Oid Omar Mashal Yafa, and in Tnu Yayin it says V'Hamashal Moed Hafla. So who's writing that? There's like a narrator that's commenting on the mashal. Oh, it's a great mashal. That's not the usual mode of writing if you're just writing a transcription. Additionally, a number of the inyanim in Tzadek v'Noisha and V'Yachsef Yaris also correspond to a Maamer, Kol Hashem Yochaylo, that was also said in Shklov the previous week, Shabbos V'Yeshev Tovkuf Nun Zayin. The Maamer, as it was said and written, also is printed in Maamer Aksarim under the pasuk Kol Hashem Yochaylo. So you have another Maamer said in Shklov the week before V'Yeshev, and the additional passages here correspond to that. So you have passages corresponding to the Maamer of Miketz, and you have passages corresponding to the Maamer of V'Yeshev. But like I said, this Sefer, the way the Sefer was edited, they scattered all the pieces, all the passages. So as far as I know, this letter has never even been printed in its entirety in the proper original Seder as it was written. And l'chayra, it was all one big letter with different shtiklach from the last tkufa. So the letter began with, most recently, Parshas Miketz Chanukah, and then it continued, and here are more shtiklach from the previous week, from Vayeshev. But who's the writer? Who's writing all of this, and to whom? So then they come and reveal at the end that there's also another shtickle in Mamar Makzarim. There's a shtickle called Inyan Masha Kana Yosef. In Vayigash, it says that Yosef took their susim and he took their chamayrim, to explain why is Yosef taking their susim and their chamayrim. And that passage, that paragraph, that shtickle is also written in the style of a letter. And that passage concludes, is signed, Achicha Hadoiv, your brother Doiv. So that is Efsher, or I would say more than Efsher. Certainly that letter was surely written by the Mittel Rebbe to the Anis Adashala, because during the era when they were close, they mamish related to each other like brothers, and they would use that terminology. So just like the shtickle from Vayigash is Achicha Hadoiv, so perhaps Bar 11 suggests these passages as well are also written by the Mittel Rebbe. So that means that we've suddenly discovered a number of letters, or at least a number of shtiklach in a letter from the Mittel Rebbe to the Aaron, also written in a somewhat interesting and unique style. And I haven't seen anybody pay this any attention beyond Bar 11 to Aris here, as he printed it in the Sefer. I'll also point out that this wasn't even included in the Igris of the Mittel Rebbe. Not even the shtickle from Vayigash that explicitly concludes Achicha Hadoiv. So if it would have been printed there, perhaps it would at least get a slightly more attention, but it has been printed there. I didn't see any indication, any acknowledgement at all of this in the Igris of the Mittel Rebbe. So it really only was ever printed once here and buried here, and that's where it was left. I think also that just the lashon, the three words bikashti or bakashasi lahidia kavanasai. If I understand correctly, he's asking his chaver for pshat. The Mittel Rebbe is asking the Aaron to say, I asked my father what this means, and this is what he said. But can you explain to me what he means? I think that also contributes to understanding the dynamic, the connection between Mittel Rebbe and Aaron during this period. And now, if you look at the Kerem Chabad in Munshan's introduction there about the letters of Reb Aaron, then you'll see that he also copied Bar 11 Za'ara from our Aktzarem, and copied it there, and seems to agree, except what the Bar 11 said. So here you see that there are more letters, there's more correspondence from Mittel Rebbe, and he points out that these letters would have been Tafkuf and Zion, based on the Titus that the Mittel Rebbe is referencing, whereas in the letters of Reb Aaron to the Mittel Rebbe, we see he says Shikmir biyad Meisik Savzeh Torah Locha Hashem Agdula, and he references the Durush Ma'isa Menorah and the Durush V'Yishloch Yeshua Meraglim, and it seems that those were from Tafkuf Nun Hey. So Aaron's letters are from Tafkuf Nun Hey, and these are from Tafkuf Nun Zion. For more on what was being the Mamarim being said at the time, you can look in the list of Mamarim in the back of Mamarim Akzarim. There you can see all the Mamarim, all the shtiklach that are related to the Alter Rebbe and Shklov Tafkuf Nun Zion. You can also look in Kerem Chabad 4, where Rabbi Yosel Keller also did a reshima of the Mamarim of the Alter Rebbe. So I really had like another half to this talk here, but I guess we're going to have to just end it here. So let me just conclude by saying that Derech Agav, we also learned the very fact that the Alter Rebbe wasn't Shklov then at all. And so it sounds like Mittel Rebbe was with him as opposed to the Aaron. What's interesting is that he writes, he begins with that Yer Be'eretz Nachriya. Sounds a little bit like Aaron is far away, is somewhere foreign, but we could go back and forth on what the exact meaning and connotation of that phrase is. But once again, this is something that we have no other information, no other knowledge about. Like I said, often we only know the Alter Rebbe's comings and goings based on what they wrote in the Mamarim as to where they were said, the date line at the beginning of the Mamarim. So in this case as well, I did not find any additional information about this. If you look in the Sikha of Fidig Rebbe Tazkis Tavish Peidalid and Ha'aris there, so he mentions the Alter Rebbe in the earlier years through Tavkuf Lamed Zayin, and he then segues to mentioning of Bikuach and Shklov. But I think the Fidig Rebbe there is referring to a much tzkufa about much earlier tzkufa where the Alter Rebbe would have gone to Shklov and the Kuach and schlepped the Chassidim there. But I don't think that's necessarily related to what we're talking about here. I did also just take a look quickly at the Alter Rebbe's letters to see if there's any letters from Alter Rebbe at the time. I said there actually is a letter from Alter Rebbe to the Anash of Vilna that's dated Tavkuf Nun Zion, and he's referring to there was talk that maybe there should be a vikuach, that the Alter Rebbe should engage in a vikuach, perhaps with the Gra. I think it's right before the Gra passed away. And the Alter Rebbe says, oh, you want a vikuach? Let me tell you the whole story. He says, 20 years ago, I remember Hadadoker. We tried coming to the Gra's house, the infamous confrontation where the Gra avoided meeting them, a very famous letter. So that letter is actually from Tafkuf Nazayin, so maybe there is some connection between the Alter Rebbe's letter to Vilna on that theme at the time and the Alter Rebbe's presence in Shklov at this time. Like I said, there was more that I had prepared to go on, but based on the timing, we're going to have to pause it here and be mamshich on the next occasion, and that's that.